Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor Adam Tooze is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, just one data point this week for you all, and it is 30,000. That is the number of jobs with Volkswagen that are now set to be lost in Germany as the company contemplates factory closures in the country for the first time ever in the history of Volkswagen.
Now then, Volkswagen is reportedly planning major job cuts as it struggles to turn around its business.
Tens of thousands of job cuts mark a 10% pay cut across the board, and 3 factories all set to be closed in Germany. That's what the company has...
Now, Kate, this is huge. It's huge for Volkswagen, but also for the German economy.
It really is. It's really hard to overstate how much this matters.
Chancellor Olaf Scholz is looking for ways to shake off Germany's economic malaise as Europe's largest economy looks set to contract for the second consecutive year. He hosted a industry...
This is just one indication of Germany's economic problems. Industrial production is down in the country for several years now. This predates the Ukraine war, in fact, and predates the pandemic. So kind of long-running economic problems that have come to a head with the government collapsing last week and now new elections scheduled for early next year. And more generally, just a pretty negative atmosphere in the country with recession and a lack of growth for the past several years, and questions about whether Germany's economic model fundamentally is flawed and may not survive in the years and decades ahead. So, Germany's economic malaise and just how serious it is something we wanted to talk about. But to start things off, obviously, there's been a lot of news around the world, in the United States specifically. And so one would be forgiven, listeners are forgiven if they've not been following the news in German politics recently. As I mentioned, the government collapsed. This is the government referred to as the Traffic Light Coalition, 3 parties that had been governing together for the past 3 years. Yeah, that just collapsed. But Adam, I'm curious if you could give a bit of context in why that happened and what the kind of backstory is.
Yeah, so the Traffic Light Coalition was an important experiment. Germany under Angela Merkel had a series of governments that basically always consisted of her Christian Democratic Party. This is going back to 2005. So a centre, right-wing Christian Democratic Party, more often than not in coalition with the Social Democrats, the old Socialist Party of Germany, whose roots, like that of the Catholic Centre Party, the Christian Democrats, go back to the 19th century. And so they'd formed a rather kind of stodgy middle ground of German politics for much of the last 20 years. And the election in 2021 promised the formation of a progressive government whose centre of gravity was to the left. And the coalition consisted of the Social Democrats, the Greens and the Liberals, who are a kind of market liberal party whose party colour is yellow. So red, green and yellow gives you the traffic light. And in terms of the electoral dynamics here, the Social Democrats represent a constituency that is older, that is more blue-collar, but not very blue-collar. Most blue-collar votes now tend to the right wing in Germany, like in the United States. It tends to be pensioners, basically, who are very committed and bought in on the social welfare apparatus that Germany built since the 19th century and extensively, of course, since the middle of the 20th century. And the 2 parties that compete, if you like, for the future of Germany, the young people's vote, notably educated younger folks, those who aren't, tend to vote for the AfD, the far-right party. But for the college-educated younger demographic, the Greens and the Liberals compete with each other, and they compete hard and very aggressively as it has emerged. The FDP is a party that polls below 10%. The Greens aspire to poll over 20%. Most of the time they poll around 15%. And in a proportional representation system, when you add these 3 parties up, you get your majority. So they're not entirely on an equal footing, but they are competing for a similar kind of zone, a similar space that is the future of Germany, but envisioned in 2 rather different ways. One is a business-friendly, market-orientated neoliberal socially liberal but economically conservative position, which is the FDP, the Liberals line. And the Greens are the world's largest and most significant ecological party, and their program is also modernizing and progressive, they would see it at least, but it of course involves much heavier degrees of government intervention with a view to bringing about the energy transition and addressing the climate crisis. And the gamble of the coalition was that you could weld together an old social welfare party, the SPD, with these two different visions of German modernity in a single coalition. And it's been tough, and it's been tough from the very beginning, because the Liberals, the FDP, have dug in on an increasingly hard fiscal conservative position. They watered that down because of the aftermath of COVID and because of the shock of the war in Ukraine. But increasingly, as the coalition's come under pressure, they've dug in on this. Finance Minister Christian Lindner was at the core of this, and this has made the position of the Greens, who need government investment, various types of other regulatory intervention, increasingly impossible as well. And the two are essentially at war with each other. And since the summer, where there was bitter argument about the current budget, in the aftermath of that, with polls in the offing anyway, and the opinion polls running very hard against the government, and the far right surging, and the Christian Democrats emerging as the dominant force with over 30% in the polls, the Liberals quite deliberately provoked a collapse of the government. And we know from research by Robert Pausch at the Zeit weekly newspaper that the FDP basically, over a series of months, actually prepared increasingly aggressive economic programs, which they knew would be rejected by their coalition partners, hoping to provoke Chancellor Scholz to finally step up, because otherwise he's been basically a bit of a non-entity, and fire Christian Lindner, allowing them then to position themselves and hope to get across the 5% hurdle that's crucial for presence in the Bundestag and therefore membership in the government in future. And so the FDP, the Liberals, are kind of trying to maneuver themselves for the aftermath of this government with a view to perhaps emerging as a useful ally of the Christian Democrats in future coalition negotiations.
Yeah, I should say, the differences between these parties were always kind of obvious, but the claim of the government was that they could kind of transcend these differences or kind of create some new synthesis that would create new progress in the country. But ultimately, as you say, they kind of collapsed because of the contradictions.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say, I don't know whether you'd agree, but I don't think the gap between Lindner and Habeck is anything any wider than the gaps you see within the Democratic Party in the United States. I don't think the bandwidth in the German government is wider than in the Democrats. And you could say, well, that proves the point. I mean, the Democrats, after all, were profoundly dysfunctional when it came to actually trying to pass the progressive agenda of the Biden administration. Sinema and Manchin essentially blocked that. And I think that would be, for American audiences, that's a really useful analogy. The way the Germans handle this, unlike in the US, is that when you form a government, you actually sign a coalition contract. It's literally called that, or a coalition treaty, in which you spend months, if necessary, hammering out your differences and pre-agree the legislation you're going to pass. And I think the Liberals have been quite widely seen as an extremely bad faith actor since that agreement was arranged. And the Social Democrats and the Greens have not had anywhere near the same kind of problems, though they have differences too. And the Liberals have been a spoiler, because they have, despite the fact that there is a contract, have repeatedly acted to position themselves as though they were the opposition rather than a member of the government carrying joint responsibility.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll get to this later in the conversation. And it strikes me that one of the differences with the United States is that in the U.S., the government had at least a lot more money to throw around, and ultimately the German government had this constitutional ruling that basically prevented them from spending the amount of money that they envisioned in that coalition contract. But I guess to look ahead to the coming election, it seems safe to assume that Olaf Scholz, the Social Democratic Chancellor, who's been atop the current government, is not going to be the country's next chancellor. Of course, the election is about to start, so who knows? We'll see. It's scheduled for late February. The campaign will be underway soon. But the assumption is that the next chancellor will be the leader of the opposition center-right Christian Democrats. That is Friedrich Merz. And if we were to sort of look ahead to trying to envision a Merz-led government, in Germany at least, there's a lot of talk among, the Christian Democrats' opponents castigating Merz for his work at BlackRock. Basically, he had left politics for a number of years and then became an executive at BlackRock in Germany, the investment firm. Yeah, so they tend to castigate him as a kind of far, Anglo-Saxon capitalist type. I'm curious whether it would be more revealing to kind of look at how his political identity is rooted instead in his home region of the Sauerland. This is a region of Western Germany that tends to be socially conservative. It's also a kind of place where the social market economy of Western Germany still exists, in at least in the imagination of the people who live there, perhaps. The famous Mittelstand industries that have always kept the country afloat, the kind of small to medium-sized family firms are still active and thriving to some extent. Is that really the kind of milieu that Merz is raised in, is still living in, and is going to try to bring back to Germany? I mean, is basically Merz more of a throwback to Germany's West German past rather than a kind of, Anglo-Saxon future of some kind?
I mean, the Sauerland thing's really interesting. Isn't that where Britta is from? Your
I should
wife.
say this.
Yeah. This is your big area of Trivial Pursuit.
Exactly.
Cam is going to be the Sauerland guy.
I have been, exactly, starting next year, if you want to know about the town, not only the region, the town where Friedrich Merz is from. I've spent a lot of time there. It's the town that my wife was raised and my in-laws still live in. In fact, Merz is
globally relevant expertise. From
I know where his parents are there in the old age home, which I've passed by regularly when I'm visiting my in-laws. But anyway, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole. I'm curious, what you think about the economy there and how that might be coloring him.
I think age is actually like a surprisingly relevant issue here. I didn't realize how, till I started doing research for this episode, like just how old Merz is. I mean, he was born in 1955. He's only 1 year younger than Angela Merkel. And in fact, that's really decisive for his entire career, because whereas Merkel was on the other side of the Iron Curtain, making a young life as a researcher, a STEM researcher in East Germany, good old Merz was coming up through the real, like exactly as you say, like the absolutely classic machine politics of Christian democracy, anti-communist, Cold War, social market liberal, West German establishment. I mean, he just absolutely, I think he's a cookie cutter figure. In fact, you could write the history of German politics in the last 30 years as pivoting on the fact that in the early 2000s, Angela Merkel made him her victim. I mean, he basically, is out of the party leadership by 2004, whereas he was, I think, widely seen as the young West German star. And it's Angela Merkel's ascent that really interrupts that career and causes him to drop out of frontline leadership in 2004, not over substance, because in the early stages, Angela Merkel herself was quite a hardline, market-orientated neoliberal. But I think really as a matter of him just realizing that she was going to take all of the oxygen out of the room for the foreseeable future, and he's an ambitious guy, and then making a very smart, one has to say, move to BlackRock, which in 2009 was not yet the world-bestriding monster that it is today, but was literally just coming out of the 2008 crisis as one of its great winners. And Merz leverages his very considerable track record already by that point in corporate law into a position at BlackRock, which, as you say, is a stigma for the German left, because the German left has quite a strong anti-finance positioning. In terms of his economics, I mean, I've tried quite hard, but I find it very difficult to find anything that marks him out as in any way distinctive or different than, exactly as you put it, your run-of-the-mill German social market conservative. I mean, he likes the debt brake. He's at least said as much, though I think everyone recognizes if he is in head chancellor of the government, they'll probably have to find ways around it. But right now, it doesn't pay for him to say that, so he doesn't say it. He likes tax cuts for businesses. He wants to increase incentives for business. He would like to pare back family benefits in favor of reducing tax on overtime. I just see him as a really middle of the road, but very dedicated and committed supply side liberal or supply side conservative. You know what in America would once have been the run of the mill centrist Republican kind of position. He is a value conservative. I mean, he was part of a Burschenschaft, which is quite significant in West Germany. So he was part of the once commonplace student fraternities in Germany, once as in the Weimar Republic and in the Wilhelmine period. But in West Germany, to be part of a Burschenschaft really means that you are distinctly on the conservative side of youth culture, to say the very least. So that's really the kind of, he's a guy who quite likes to take a hardline position. He's a noted polemicist. He's really, he comes across as, like I always say, comes across as a really mean schoolmaster, but apparently that's popular with at least about a third of the German electorate. And he really is not afraid of polemics. He goes after people really quite hard. And he is anti-green, and that is the ticket on which both the Liberals and the Christian Democrats are running. It narrows down their coalitional possibilities, to be honest. But he's anti-green in the sense, not that he's a climate denier, you just can't do that in Germany, but he thinks carbon capture is probably the way to go. They have this slogan, which is technological openness, Technologieoffenheit, which means that the government isn't going to try and pick technologies that matter. And he is a diehard defender of the internal combustion engine. So he's one of the few sentient people who still believe that whether or not the internal combustion engine survives long term is an open question. So it's a notable profile, and it's really the alternative of the conservatism that Germans didn't take in the early 2000s when they opted for Merkel instead.
I guess if we look back and how we got to this point with this malaise in Germany, it does seem like one thing that's gone wrong is that Germany has kind of missed the boat on the digital economy. Obviously, the United States is a standout in terms of the major digital companies that dominate the US economy based in Silicon Valley. Germany doesn't really have an analog to that and is perhaps suffering for it. And I'm curious, what is the backstory on where Germany went wrong with this digital economy? Was this rooted in failed political decisions, or is it failures of the country's capital markets to make good investment decisions? Is this a kind of failure on that side? Or in Germany, are these kind of two sides linked in some ways? I know that some of the major financial actors are the Landesbanken, these banks that are under political control to some extent. So were the kind of financial decisions paired with political decisions in some fundamental way that led to this ultimate problem?
It's easy to get down on Germany and digital. You and I can both tell a story of how hard it is to record a podcast online for lack of reliable internet connection in the most important capital city of Europe. That apparently, the fact that Wi-Fi connection just can't be accounted on in Berlin, apparently goes back to decisions made in the 1980s in a kind of crony capitalist way, where the then Chancellor Helmut Kohl had some buddies in the budding German private television business who liked copper cables as a way of running the TV and telephone service. And so the Germans got bought in on technology that really in the end, of course, has come off second best. I think, however, that kind of impressionism is a little unfair. After all, there's a fallacy in comparing national economies with each other. Germany's economy is large and important, but it's bigger than that of New York. But, it's a bit like asking, when did New York State miss the digital boat train? Europe as a whole failed to track the United States when it came to platform businesses, and failed to track Korea, Taiwan when it came to hardware production. But Germany, viewed as a region within Europe, has champions. It has Infineon in chips, it has SAP in enterprise software, and it has Siemens in industrial automation. And by any standard worldwide, these are significant players in their particular niches of tech. And in quantum, where Europe's disadvantage relative to the United States and Asia is relatively less severe. This is one of the conclusions of the Draghi report. Munich University, Cologne University are significant centers, and IBM has a research center in Germany for quantum computing. So, when we do like-for-like comparisons, it's important not to compare Germany with 80 million people and an economy of 4 trillion euros with the United States, which is vastly larger as an entity. But I think what's really telling is the infrastructure side, as mentioned, and then on the other end, really the failure of Germany's leading manufacturing firms, other than Siemens, which really does have a very important role in very high-end manufacturing processes. That firms other than those to really make the digital leap. And by far and away, the most significant sector to fail here is the automotive sector, which is not just Germany's, but Europe's leading sector of R&D. If you look at the R&D rankings for Europe, they're dominated by German auto firms. And they basically failed to understand that the future of the car was not ultimately refining the internal combustion engine and incredible suspension and so on, but basically making the car into a cell phone and social media and digital entertainment system on wheels. And that's what none of the German car manufacturers have really grasped this. And so that's where they're now struggling to catch up.
So what would it then mean then for the German car industry to get outcompeted simply then by Tesla and Chinese car companies on this new next generation of e-autos? I mean, would that amount to a fatal blow to the German economy as a whole? I mean, how much of the German economy is tied up in the car industry to begin with and the kind of associated industries of parts, et cetera? I mean, if Germany held on to the internal combustion engine, I mean, could that survive as a niche product, I guess, in some ways in the global economy? And what sort of blowback would that have for the national economy?
I think there's really two ways of looking at this, and I'm always torn back and forth between them. Like, if you view this from a macro perspective, then really you kind of have to say everyone should chill a little bit because, you know, Germany's workforce paying social insurance, so people employed, is 35 million people. And the highest estimate that you get for the automotive sector is 2 million. The core workforce actually making vehicles and the key components for them is more in the order of 700,000 people. So we're talking a relatively modest fraction of a big, complicated economy. So if you see some shrinkage, and we definitely have seen that in the German auto industry, they used to be turning out 5.8 million vehicles a year before COVID. They're now down to just over 4 million. So there's been a very dramatic decrease in their total volume of production. You know, this is a shock. It's a shock for particular firms. It's a shock for particular regions. It's a shock for the supply chain. You know, you can go out to an estimate as high as 2 million people who are in indirect ways employed, still well short of even 10% of the workforce, but nevertheless a bigger number. All of those groups will, of course, be badly hit if the German auto industry goes into crisis, but it's just one piece of a very big aggregate, which is a highly sophisticated modern economy, which doesn't actually live by metal bashing and exporting, but lives, like most other economies, largely by integrating goods into service sector driven provision. This is true for Germany as it is for every other advanced economy, even though the Germans have a hard time really realizing this. So that's, as it were, the deflationary account of this crisis. In Germany itself right now, that argument is as though you're coming from a different planet, right? And, you know, in fairness to them, I think that's because the auto industry truly is a symbol of German economic development. It wasn't Germany, though it invented the car in the late 19th century, was not in the early 20th century a great success story. It's really the post-war West Germany that becomes this dominant global player in highly sophisticated car production. And for that, as it were, to change is truly a changing of the tides, right? I mean, there are very few brands in the entire world more famous than, you know, the big four: VW, Mercedes, BMW, and Bosch. Like these are iconic brands the world over, and if they suffer a really serious financial and economic crisis, understandably, that's a big blow to, after all, what is a modest European economy. Even more important are the jobs and where they're concentrated, and these are core constituencies of what's left of the German industrial working class, which is still highly organized in the biggest trade union, I think probably the most powerful trade union, I think, in the world anyway, which is IG Metall, the German metalworking union, which is heavily represented in VW. And we're talking co-determination here. So they have board level representation. And then there's all the spin-off. And the spin-off is not just jobs and value added, but it's actually an entire technological network. And as I was saying, the German automotive hub is arguably the most dynamic industrial R&D core. I don't think it's arguable, actually. I think it's just a fact in Europe in terms of, and certainly in terms of scale. Maybe Airbus you could count as a rival in terms of sophistication, but it's nowhere near as large as a tech hub. And so for that to not just enter a crisis, but to find itself historically eclipsed, you know, to be literally stuck in a technology that just doesn't make sense anymore, And this isn't, these are performance-orientated firms. Like German car companies, like sweated blood to get their acceleration figures to, sub 5 seconds for 100-kilometer-an-hour acceleration. And now, some jumped-up electric car manufacturer comes along, and you just whoop a few more engines and a bit more battery in, and these things accelerate like no one's ever accelerated before. It's humiliating to discover that the entire game that you were playing technologically is just irrelevant. And objectively speaking, by any measure, the electric vehicles, once you can get the charging sorted out, are preferable in many ways to even the most sophisticated products of the internal combustion engine area. And that's setting aside any environmental concerns. They're just higher performing vehicles. And that I think is really it's an undeniable, it's a huge shock, and it affects at least 3 of the major parties. Like, it affects the SPD because of the workers, and it affects the FDP and the CDU because of business concerns and almost like a kind of cultural style. One way of describing the FDP liberals is as Autobahn liberals. Their idea of freedom is going as fast as they damn well like on the Autobahn in their Porsche. Like, that's their fantasy of freedom. It's like the American road trip, but it's all about speed and ultimate performance. So it's a kind of exclusive, it's quite a class exclusive idea, but that aristocratic idea of being able to just, get in your Porsche at 11 at night and go to 250 kilometers an hour and like not look back. That's their idea of the future. And so it shakes them to discover that, they might need to do that now in a Tesla or a Chinese car, heaven forbid.
Yeah, it's okay. It's useful to be reminded of that. It's not just an economic crisis, it's a crisis of identity for modern Germany. We will take a quick break here, but we will be back in a second to continue talking about the German economy. Okay, welcome back. So we were talking before about how in all likelihood it's the Christian Democrats who are going to be leading the next government in Germany. And I'm curious, what kind of distinctive approach does Christian democracy offer for Germany's current challenges, that it faces right now, but also more generally? I mean, the United States doesn't really have a party with this distinct history, distinct philosophy at its foundation. So yeah, maybe we could try to unpack it a bit. I mean, what is Christian democracy's distinctive approach to economic issues? I mean, there are a couple that come to mind for me. One, there's this kind of idea of subsidiarity. I mean, that's sort of rooted in Catholic teaching, I think, where you sort of concentric circles of policy making where things happen at the most local possible level. But at the same time as that, there's a kind of, internationalism at the heart of Christian democracy as well. It strikes me that it's not an accident that it was Christian Democrats that kind of pushed to create the EU after the Second World War and pushed it forward in the decades afterwards. So, yeah, what does this all add up to as a philosophy for Germany right now? I mean, maybe is it possible to imagine that the Christian Democrats could strengthen Europe now, even maybe more easily than other parties have been able to in Germany?
Yeah, I think this is a super interesting question. You're absolutely right. Christian democracy was absolutely non-accidentally one of the driving political forces, so arguably the driving political force behind the formation of the EU after World War II. And you put it in terms of internationalism, I would put it, you could put it more negatively. It's an anti-nationalism. So Christian Democrats, or especially because Christian democracy comes out of Catholicism first and foremost. Protestantism was always the religion of nationalism in Europe, going all the way back to the Reformation. Catholicism has this unitary kind of claim, and not always realized in practice, but that's an ideological resource. And in the wake of fascism in Germany and Italy, Catholicism emerged as a claim on to a wider European identity. It also, of course, differentiates Europe historically from Islam. So it's one of the dividing lines, and against communism. So Catholicism was one of the anchors of anti-communism in the post-war period and all the way through to the Pope Wojtyla and Solidarność in Poland, which somebody like the young Friedrich Merz, knowing people like this growing up in West Germany, a little younger than him, but nevertheless knowing folks in this kind of milieu, they dug this so hard, they loved it, right? That, Catholicism was arriving to rescue Eastern Europe from the nightmare of communism. All of this is pretty deep in the DNA. And in the generation, it's surprisingly, it's only one generation before Friedrich Merz and Angela Merkel. That is Helmut Kohl. This was incredibly pronounced. So this was the Chancellor of Germany that brought about unification from the early 80s through to the 1990s. And if he was a passionate European, like he was a European that was really of the post-war generation, exemplified exactly that kind of logic that you're invoking, Cam. I'm not sure whether Merz fits quite in that mold. With Angela Merkel, there was always this question of whether she was a European because she was East German and she was very Anglophone and America and Britain orientated. She turned into a major figure in European politics because of her role in brokering the constitutional arrangements in the late 2000s and then in handling the Eurozone. A very ambiguous European figure, but a deeply committed, she did politics at the European scale. Merz started his career as a European parliamentarian, so he certainly knows the system. The Germans currently, Ursula von der Leyen, the most consequential European Commission president since Delors in the 80s, is German and of his party, so she's a CDU figure. Another one of the people that was kind of caught in the wind shadow, the great shadow of Angela Merkel, and ended up exiting to Brussels. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how Merz positions himself in Europe. I would expect him to drive a less perversely dogmatic line than the Liberals have in recent years, who've basically used Europe as an opportunity for sounding off and looking tough. But I would expect Merz to drive a hard bargain on all European business. I don't think he's going to be a comfortable person for the Europeans to deal with, because I think he's going to apply the same kind of medicine to Germany if he gets the chance. And so that is the kind of mood in which the Germans then are very unwilling to make concessions to anyone else. And I don't know quite how that's going to play out. The crucial issues will be who ultimately replaces Macron in the French presidency, and where and how that kind of anchoring relationship would work. He's a little bit, since his days in Europe, which are now decades ago, since he's spent so much of his time in opposition, it's a little hard to figure out, exactly where he's going to stand on European issues, I think.
Yeah, I mean, just as a footnote here, I guess I should have mentioned that about the Sauerland, in addition to being a place with, kind of these medium-sized industries and socially conservative, it's also heavily Catholic, or maybe that social conservatism is rooted in that Catholicism. Every town has the big Catholic church in the center of town, and that is the milieu that Merz still moves in. So we'll see if that informs his approach to any of these European matters, maybe this kind of civilizational imagination about Europe's mission. But I guess to return to the bigger questions about Germany's malaise, I'm curious, whether, just simply put, it's we should be imagining Germany ending up in some ways as Japan, basically, a big economy, one that was a major exporter, is a major exporter, rooted in these industries, but one that seems to be in stagnation and perhaps is in some kind of permanent stagnation. And if that's the case, is that even such a bad fate for Germany if it were to end up as another Japan in Europe?
I think this is a very important kind of perspectival question, just to make sure we give the right impression. I mean, Japan and Germany's economic trajectories since the early 90s are very, very different, because whereas Japan's GDP per capita really crested early in the late 80s and early 90s and has largely stagnated since, that's just not true for Germany. So Germany is 50% better off in real terms, as best we can estimate that, over the last 30 years. And anyone like you that lives there or visits regularly like me can tell the difference. I mean, it is an incredibly prosperous place now. Not uniformly, of course. Like most other advanced economies, Germany's main problems are inequality and good governance around issues like education, migration, and so on. But this is a very rich, affluent society which offers its citizens much higher life expectancy on average than virtually anywhere in the United States, let alone national average, that has very, very high standard of living. by any measure, it's a huge success story. The difficulty, in a sense, is adjusting precisely to the fact that it's no longer dominating the headlines as Europe's success story, which for really since the early 2000s it's been able to do. There was a phase when it was the sick man of Europe in the late 90s, and that stuck quite deeply in the German memory bank. But for a couple of decades now, it's been a success story, really, until, as you said, but even before COVID, growth began to slow down quite sharply. So, I mean, A, I don't think growth is over, but B, if it were, it wouldn't be the end of the world. But C, is the major adjustment necessary to this new, even slower growth rate? And are there a whole bunch of outstanding, very significant social issues? There certainly are. And I think a creative and constructive politics, which is where the Greens were at, to be honest. And I should admit, I'm very party pre here. I would never in my life vote for the CDU, and I'm quite closely involved with the Greens. The Greens are formulating a policy of modernization that is about qualitative change, essentially about adjustment to the climate crisis. I'm afraid with Merz, one of the more traditional elements is that he still seems, I think, to think that prioritizing business-led growth is the alpha and omega of German politics. And I think that's quite remote from realities, actually, and does reflect his age.
I guess to finish off this conversation, I wanted to return to someone you mentioned a little bit ago, namely Angela Merkel. She is actually about to publish her memoir. When this podcast goes live, I think the memoir will be officially released. I have not been able to get my hands on it, but apparently a copy's on its way to me. It's titled Freedom, very simply. And I'm curious, Merkel was chancellor for 16 years. For much of that time, she was very celebrated. If we were to look back now, I'm curious how you think she'll be remembered by history. Will she be remembered kindly for her 16 years in power?
Yeah, I managed to get, there's a very long excerpt from the memoirs that was published in the Die Zeit, the weekly. So that's as much as I've seen of the text. I have to say it's just about what you'd expect an Angela Merkel memoir to be. It's not exactly, a page-turning, exciting prose, but it's interesting that the passages which have been published so far are telling there about her childhood in East Germany and the complexities of growing up as a kind of non-aligned, if not dissident person, and then the encounters with Trump, which are vividly described, and of which Angela Merkel can, if you ever have the chance to meet her in person, give a very, very funny impression. But the bit that they've already, I think, preemptively decided to put out because it's so controversial is the issue really of Ukraine and Georgia's NATO membership, which was raised very abruptly and to everyone's amazement in 2008 by the Bush administration in its last days. And the reason why Merkel is defensive about this is that for her, during her chancellorship, she continued the policy of détente, essentially, which began in the 1970s between what was formerly Germany in the 50s and 60s, as you'd expect, was West Germany, was a hawkishly anti-communist, embattled rump state. And in the 70s, the mood changed and Germany became a key player in the era of détente with the Soviet Union, not with China, that came later with economics, but with the Soviet Union and with Eastern Europe, with Poland and with East Germany. And Merkel was in no way exceptional in continuing this policy. Growing up in East Germany, she spoke very fluent Russian in the same way as Putin speaks extremely fluent German. And so the two of them had a possibility of exchange which is very unlike that of any West European politician. There are East European politicians who had a similar kind of relationship, like the Bulgarian prime minister. But Merkel, there was always a sort of question mark about her relationship with Putin and intense interest in it because it's bilingual, essentially. But she continued a policy which was essentially, at the time, no one really thought much of it. But in retrospect, given Russia's aggression against Ukraine in 2022, has come to seem like, the hallmark of a kind of appeasement and a sellout to a tyrant that we should have understood was a danger to peace in Europe, and we should have understood this years ago. And the key moment in retrospect for defenders of the Ukrainian national cause is the fact that in 2008, when the Bush administration very abruptly, and to the surprise even of people like Condi Rice, suddenly jumped the gun and said, right, we're going to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, Germany and France resisted this quite doggedly. And in the end, they ended up with this terrible compromise whereby, on the one hand, they weren't given a track to membership. And Ukraine then was not in the state that it is in now. in terms of its domestic politics. And on the other hand, there was a paper promise that they would, in due course, find their place within NATO. So they managed not really to give Ukraine and Georgia any effective support, and Georgia paid the price later in the year with a nasty short war with Russia. But on the other hand, to provoke, so they provoked Russia and gave no effective support. And Merkel says this herself, and I think that's a fair assessment. I think in due course, I don't get it. I think this is a very blatant case of hindsight, of the vicissitudes of history changing the assessment of people's positions. I think Angela Merkel can look after herself. We don't need to worry about the fairness of history to Angela Merkel. But I do. There's a very sudden shift in perspective, which doesn't accord with a reasonable account of decisions that were made at the time. Obama, because the Ukrainian crisis didn't start in 22, as everyone now likes to remind themselves. It started in 2013, 2014, and it was a mess. And it was a mess from both the European and the American side. But it was a mess the Americans were only too happy to hand off to Berlin and Paris to sort out with the Minsk process, right? Obama's administration was not interested in getting its hands dirty with that European problem. So it's not as though, as it were, there was John McCain's strident voice in favor of, Western backing for Ukraine was actually the dominant position in Washington. It absolutely wasn't. And Merkel and the French government at the time under François Hollande had to do their best to hold the line with, as we know, very limited resources. And that is maybe where you can really fault Merkel, and this is, to me, a more general point about her chancellorship, is that she just, she is an incredibly sophisticated, brilliantly intelligent person with a wide view of history, but she did not make the decisive decisions that would have been necessary to prepare Germany for the future on the energy front or on the national defense front. And I think a lot would be forgivable if there'd actually been serious moves to establish German autonomy, and she knew it and she understood, because she had these very high stakes, very unpleasant encounters with Trump, and came back from those in the spring of 2017 saying now Europe needs to stand on its own 2 feet, and precious little happened. And I think that's where I really think questions have to be asked, is though, okay, fine, there was a continuity of policy, and picking fights with Putin or standing, sort of asserting positions, Cold War positions against him. It's easy to see why that was unattractive. But then why not do, as Merkel would always say, why not do your homework? Why not actually make the investments, start building preparatory positions? And why instead persist with projects like Nord Stream, which, subsequently appear like, very, very bad investments? So I think that's where when it's not the atmospherics, it's actually the concrete detail of policy, which is where also I wrote extensively and very critically about her government in the Eurozone crisis, where again her leadership was anything but liberal, anything but progressive, but really halting and in the end totally inadequate to the crisis. And again, in that case, she hands off decision making to the ECB and Mario Draghi, who have to pull, as the Germans would say, have to pull the chestnuts from the fire.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see what she has to say, specifically about Nord Stream, that decision, and the Euro crisis more generally. It will be published both in German and English, so anyone out there who's interested should be able to find a copy in their own language, I think other languages as well. So keep an eye out for it. Otherwise, we will be back next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.